Welcome. This Management 2020 video reviews patterns for capitalization and punctuation in English. So we're going to look at some capitalization patterns in English, what kinds of words get capitalized, and then we will review a variety of punctuation symbols to identify their names and also their use. So let's start with capitalization. What is capitalization? Well, these are the big letters versus small letters. Another term for these words are lowercase, which are the small letters, and uppercase, which are the big letters. And this comes from the days of typeset and printing presses, where the big letters were stored at the top of the case and the small letters were stored at the bottom of the case, so the lower and uppercase terms. Why does capitalization matter? I mean, in spoken English, you can't tell which words I'm using that are capitalized and which words are not capitalized. It's not a feature that appears in spoken language. But it is important to maintain a professional nature of our writing. There are some expected patterns, and capitalization can help signal different features of our language when it's in written form. So if we don't follow those features, then we risk not looking professional. It's very common in text messages, especially in probably the last few decades, to not capitalize. But when we are sending professional email, when we are writing professional documents, if we don't use capitalization, that will undermine our message. It'll undermine what people think of us and our organization. So learning these patterns can help us look more professional so that we can strengthen the relationships we have with those with whom we communicate. So here are some common patterns for capitalization in English. Always, first letter of the first word of a sentence in English gets capitalized. Okay. We also capitalize the first letter of proper nouns. So proper nouns are usually names of people, places, other entities. Um, we capitalize days of the week, months of the year, names of holidays. And we capitalize titles of people or works like books or movies or articles. So here's an example sentence that uses capitalization. The governor of Utah is coming to visit Southern Utah University on Friday, the 24th of July, which is Pioneer Day. We've capitalized the title. Okay, his official title is Governor of Utah. We've capitalized the name of the university, Southern Utah University. We capitalized the word Friday. We capitalized the word July, and we've capitalized the holiday, Pioneer Day. But now here is a similar sentence that gets at the same idea that doesn't use anything that requires capitalization other than the first letter of the sentence. The governor of our state is coming to our university next month on the state holiday. In none of these cases, we're not using proper nouns. We're not naming days of the week, months of the year, or holidays. We're not stating titles of people or works. And so the only capital letter in this sentence is the first letter of the first word. If you need to review capitalization patterns, your textbook has examples, and you can find good examples on the internet as well. But hopefully this is familiar to you, but it can serve as a good reminder. And again, if you have questions as you're writing documents, you can refer back to those guides. So let's talk about punctuation. Why does punctuation matter? Well, again, punctuation doesn't appear in spoken language, but in many cases, punctuation is a way to try to represent some of the features of spoken language that are not represented by letters. And so things like changes in our tone, rising and falling tone, punctuation can kind of try to capture that. Pauses in our speaking can also be captured by punctuation. Again, there are some forms of writing where people don't use punctuation. Text messages, for example. I've also seen blog posts that are just more like stream of consciousness, no punctuation, a series of ideas without any punctuation. Why is this a problem? Well, it increases the cognitive burden of the audience. If the audience is having to work harder to figure out when does one complete thought end? When does another complete thought begin? How are these ideas connected to one another? What are statements? What are questions? Just, it's so much more work on the reader if we don't use punctuation. Good punctuation helps guide the reader through a sentence or a paragraph. And again, that's our goal. We want to be audience focused. We want to help the audience consume information as quickly, efficiently, and clearly as possible so they can then use that information and apply it to their jobs. So what we don't want to do is create extra work for the reader. And if we don't use punctuation appropriately, we've created that extra work for the reader. So we're going to go through a variety of English punctuation symbols. We're going to figure out what their name is, and then we'll talk about how we use them in English. So here is a symbol. Can you identify and name this symbol? If you want, you can always pause the video, think about it, and move on. So this is a period. British English might refer to this as a full stop. So if you've spoken other varieties of English, you might know it as a full stop, but in the United States, we call it a period. Now, this symbol also has other names when we use it in different situations. We call it a dot, often when we're using it in a website address, okay? But most often we refer to it as a period. When do we use a period? Again, if you want, you can pause the video and question yourself, and then you can compare your response to mine. Well, most commonly, it's used to end a sentence, okay? Sentences that are statements. The majority of sentences in English are going to be statements. We're going to end them with a period. Now, in terms of spacing, there is no space before a period. So when you're ending a sentence and you have the last letter of the last word, the period comes immediately after that last letter. There's no space before the period. But we do put one space after the period, especially if we're going to start another sentence. And so that helps give space between the sentences. On older types of writing or old manuals you might have seen about editing, it might say put two spaces after a period when you're using a keyboard. That was most frequently due to the font styles of old typewriters, and where two spaces was easier to notice the space. Digital word processing software doesn't need that extra space. So you'll find that style guides, which many companies and organizations adopt as a way to help them understand how to use capitalization, punctuation, grammar, and vocabulary consistently and professionally and effectively, they will not tell people to put in two spaces. But if you talk to maybe your parents or grandparents, they might have learned to always put two spaces after a period. That is more old-fashioned. I don't recommend it. Ultimately, you decide what's right for you. Okay, what's this symbol? The question mark. How do we use a question mark? To end a sentence. Okay, and the same thing, there's no space before. So when you end the sentence with the last word, immediately put the question mark if this is a question sentence. Don't leave a space before the question mark, which is different than some other European languages. Right? Some European languages, because this essentially has two parts to it, right? A curvy part and then a dot, you would leave a space before and after it, but not in English. You only put a space after the quotation mark or the question mark, never a space before the question mark. What's this symbol? An exclamation point. How do we use it? Okay, to show strong emotion at the end of a statement or a sentence. Be careful. Exclamation points should be used sparingly. In business and professional contexts, almost never. We almost never want to show really strong emotion because we want to show that we are calm, collected. But there may be some cases, maybe in an email to a friend where you're trying to celebrate something with a friend. I would really caution against using an exclamation point to show maybe anger in an email. You just want to be able to communicate in a calm and positive way with people. You want to use your communication to build relationships, not damage them. And so be careful with the exclamation point, especially because it may not be clear whether you're showing surprise or happiness or anger. And so sometimes it can be difficult to read the emotion unless you constructed the sentence really well to clearly indicate which emotion you're trying to highlight. But same thing, no spaces before the exclamation point at the end of the sentence. It immediately comes after the last letter of the last word, but there is one space after it. Okay, how about these symbols? They're always used in pairs. American English uses double. Sometimes British English will just use single on both sides, but the format in American English is to use both. So they're called quotation marks. Why do we use them? Okay, most commonly, we use them to indicate a quote or the exact words of a sentence. So here's an example sentence. My boss said, "We value your contributions." Okay, "we value your contributions" are the exact words that the boss said. And so we want to put those in the quotation marks. Okay. Um, so here, there's some rules about how we use them. There's one space before the opening quotation mark. And we can see that in our example sentence there. We said, my boss said, comma, space, open quotation mark. So there's one space before the opening. Okay. But then there's no space after before we get to that, the W, right? So that W is right beside the opening quotation mark. There's a space before it, but not after it. Okay. Now then when we end the sentence, okay, there's no space before okay, we have a period there, and immediately we have the end quotation mark, but we will put a space after. Once we close the quotation, we put a space, and then we can start a new sentence after. Sometimes you may be dealing with a quote where someone is quoting someone else. If that happens, then the quote within the quotes use the single quotation marks. This is extremely rare. I can't think of any situation that you're likely to use it in business and professional writing. It is possible. It happens to more probably in humanities where they might be quoting someone who's quoting someone else. In business writing, you're not likely to encounter that. Now, something to keep in mind, in American English, periods and commas should be included inside the quotes. So you'll notice there that the period in the sentence, "we value your contributions," happens inside the quotes, and then the quotation marks are immediately after it. There are some forms of English where the punctuation marks come outside of the quotation marks, but commas and periods for American English are inside. Now, exclamation points and question marks, well, it depends. If we think of the exclamation point or the question mark as being part of that quote, somebody said something that we're quoting that was strong emotion, or somebody said something that is a question, then put the exclamation mark and the question mark inside the quotation marks. If you, as a writer, have quoted that, but then you want to add the emotion or you want to add the question, as part of your bigger sentence, then put it on the outside. Again, these are really rare situations where this would happen. But again, if you have a question, refer back to a good, reliable source. Okay, what are these symbols? They're called parentheses, okay, singular, a parenthesis. I just spelled that wrong, I just realized. So ignore my spelling. How do we use them? To provide non-required information in a sentence that may be useful, but it's not necessary. In fact, we should be able to remove the information in parentheses from the sentence and still have a grammatical sentence. Okay. Now, how do we use them in terms of spacing? Well, before we start an opening parentheses, we put a space, like quotation marks, but then we immediately put the word. Okay, so when we open it up, then we write the word right away. There should be no space between the opening and the word that follows. Okay. And then same thing when we close it, it should come immediately after the end of that sentence without any spaces, but there should be a space after it unless we are putting some punctuation at the end, and then we put a space. Okay. These are sometimes used when you just want to provide some extra information to someone to maybe help clarify some things. But again, just remember that you should be able to remove all of the words inside the parentheses and still have a grammatical sentence. What are these? Called brackets, or they might be called square brackets. When do we use them? Probably almost never. They're not very commonly used, but there are some particular uses, okay? And the most common one that you're probably likely to encounter in your reading, I don't know if you'll ever do it in your own writing, is when we need to change a quote or clarify some information within a quote. Okay, we don't want to change the quote too much because we want it to be preserved, but then we provide the square brackets that might change a verb tense. So maybe it was in the past and we want to make it the present or vice versa. Or maybe there was something was listed maybe plural and we want to make it singular. So we put those square brackets around the part of the sentence that we're changing. And that signals to the reader this quote has been changed, but it's a minor change that's been made more for grammatical or clarity reasons. They're not changing the words in it. They're trying to preserve it as much as possible, but they want to make the bigger sentence that it's part of grammatical. And so to do that, they have to maybe make some minor changes. So again, not very commonly used, but now you're aware if you see it, what it's signaling. Okay, what's this symbol? It's appearing at the bottom line of a sentence. It's called a comma. How do we use it? Oh, so many ways. Commas get a lot of work in English. Most commonly, or maybe most simply, they represent a pause in a sentence, or they separate items in a list. Now, what does that mean? Well, sometimes they're used to separate an introductory word or phrase from the rest of the sentence. They can be used to combine two independent clauses with a coordinating conjunction. We haven't talked about this yet. We'll talk about it more. They also can be used to separate an dependent clause from an independent clause. Again, we haven't really talked about those terms yet. And they can also be used to separate dates, addresses, and greetings. Okay, what's this symbol? It looks like the same, but instead of being at the bottom line of the sentence, it's at the top of the sentence. This is an apostrophe. Okay, how do we use the apostrophe? Thankfully, much simpler than a comma. Two really main uses in English. Okay, one is to indicate possession. The other one is to form contractions. So look at our sample sentence here. I can't find Don's notebook. Can't is a contraction for cannot. Okay, so when we condense a word and we remove letters from it to form a contraction, we place the apostrophe in the space where the letters were removed. Okay, so for example, we might have it is, and we remove the I to make its, then we put the apostrophe in there. And then the word dawns, this is the possessive form in English. We want to show that someone has ownership or something has ownership of something else. And so we use the name or the noun of that thing that has the ownership and we put apostrophe S after it. What is this symbol? Okay, if you thought of dash or technically this one's an M dash. And the reason why it's called M dash is it should be about the width of a capital letter M. Now there are something called an M dash, there's something called an N dash, and there's something called a common dash. We'll look at all of them. If you don't know the difference between them and use them all the same, you're probably fine. Only editors or strict grammarians are going to make distinctions between these. But I do want to cover them just so you know what this language is. When I have worked in the industry field, I'm almost always worked with an editor, and editors are really strict about these symbols, but they will likely be the ones who will go through and edit text in order to make it comply with the style guide for the company. And so they're going to care about these things. But if we know the language, then we can better communicate with editors. So this one's an M dash. How do we use it? Well, an M dash is used most commonly to separate information from the main sentence, kind of like parentheses, okay? It could be non-essential information. You could remove it and you'd still have a grammatical sentence. So you might start with an M dash, put in the non-essential information, end with the M dash. Or sometimes, stylistically, someone might write a sentence and then they want to shift kind of the direction of the sentence and they'll end the sentence in a new direction. And so the M dash connects the old part of the sentence with the new part of the sentence. That is a very rare usage. You won't see it much. You probably won't ever use it, but I want you to be aware of it. So here's our example sentence where we're using an M dash almost like parentheses. The offices of the three new employees, Chen, Liam, and Victoria, are right down the hall. We could remove Chen, Liam, and Victoria from the sentence. We'd still have a grammatical sentence. The offices of the three new employees are right down the hall. So it's just a way to signal here's some extra information that can be helpful, but it's not essential to the sentence. Okay, this symbol then is should be the M dash. Yeah, there we go, the M dash. I just wanted to comment there on the spacing of M dashes. That can depend on the style guide. So sometimes there are spaces before M dashes, sometimes there's not. It's more common not to put spaces around M dashes, but you'll see variations because this is a symbol that there isn't necessarily consensus in all English users exactly how to use it. So this one's the N dash, okay? It's about the width of a capital N, so it's a little bit shorter. How is it used? Well, most oftenly, an N dash, strictly speaking, is used to separate spans of numbers, dates, times, pages, those kinds of things. So here's an example. Their working hours are 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. That one there is an N dash, not an M dash. Does it matter to you? Probably not. To an editor, yes, it would matter. Okay. So an editor would also make a distinction then with this last symbol. Okay. This last symbol can be called a hyphen or a common dash. It has two names. Okay. Hyphens you're probably going to see more frequently than M and N dashes. Okay. How do we explain its use? Well, most commonly for compound words. Okay. We want to join two words. Then we can put a hyphen between them. We also see hyphens over line breaks. So if you have a word processor and you write a really long word near the end of the line, it's going to split that word in half, and it's going to put a hyphen to separate them to signal to the reader this word isn't complete, the rest of the word's on the next line. You might also see it in some forms of writing where someone wants to spell out letters, right? And so they're going to put S space P space, or not space, but hyphen between them, S hyphen P hyphen E hyphen L hyphen L. Um, is that going to be common in business writing? Probably not very much. Maybe in narrative types of writing where we want to put in a lot of dialogue that someone is maybe spelling out letters and from words. Not likely to happen in your own writing, but at least now you know that hyphen is considered the appropriate symbol to use in such a situation. So M, N, and hyphens, you're probably just going to use hyphens. Both M and N dashes probably aren't as frequently available on a keyboard. You have to usually go up to insert symbol. Some word processors, if you type two hyphens in a row with a space, it will convert your hyphens to an M dash, but not all word processors are designed to work that way. So hyphen is probably good enough for you, but I just wanted you to be aware of N and M dashes. What is this symbol? This is the semicolon. How do we use it? To separate two connected sentences. So if we have two sentences that are really closely connected, instead of separating them with a period, we could put a semicolon. And what that signals to the reader is these are definitely separate sentences, but their ideas are so closely connected that I want you to think about them as a unified idea together. And so it's kind of like a softer connection than a period. We also use them to separate items in a complicated list. So if you have a really long list, especially if that list has items that contain commas, then using commas to separate the items will be confusing to the reader because they'll think, well, you're using commas here to separate some adjectives, but are those separate items in the list or is that all one item? So that's when we might use the semicolon to separate the items that are so complicated that they're really long or that they have commas within them, that then the semicolon serves as the symbol that signals the separation of items within that list. Is this commonly used? No, not a lot, because usually we don't have really complicated lists. And if we did, maybe the best solution is, especially in business writing, is put it into a bulleted or a numbered list, not inside a paragraph. That's messier. So again, business writing is not as likely to use a semicolon to separate a list because we would more likely use a bulleted list. Okay, what's this symbol? Called a colon. How do we use it? It has a few different uses. It can be used to introduce lists. It can be used to introduce a really long quote. And in rare situations, it can be used to introduce a question. I rarely ever see it used that way. Most commonly used to introduce a list. Okay, now another way that it can be used is to provide an explanation or clarification. So I actually use this sometimes in my writing. Well, I will write a sentence, and then rather than creating a second sentence that defines a key word in the sentence, if that last word or phrase is at the end of my sentence, then I'll put a colon and I'll explain what that word means. And that can be an easier way. Instead of having to create two sentences, I can combine them into one. And the reader knows when they see that semicolon that information that comes after the semicolon is providing an explanation or definition for the concept that was in the previous part of the sentence. You might also see it to separate a title from a subtitle, especially in academic writing. This happens a lot. So they'll give something a title, and then they put a semicolon, and then they put a more descriptive title. And then, of course, we also see them used with numbers quite a bit, with time, with ratios, with scripture references. So we covered a variety of capitalization patterns, those basic patterns, and then many different punctuation symbols. Again, you can refer to this video or your textbook if you need to review this, but also the internet has lots of great resources where you can go and learn what are the most common uses of punctuation symbols in English. Some of them are used a lot, like commas and periods, and some of them are more rarely used, like the en dash or the colon. But understanding them can help you use these symbols more appropriately and accurately so that you look more professional and you're helping communicate information clearly to your audience.